A fist crashed down on a heavy oak table and split it clean in two. Splinters flew across the stone floor. A goblet rolled off the edge and rang against the ground. Men scattered back against the walls. A roar tore through the hall so loud the torches shuddered on their hooks. Every wolf in the room dropped their eyes to the floor. Nobody moved. Nobody breathed. At the center of it all stood a huge man, thick neck, shaved head, jaw clenched so tight the muscle jumped. His name was Dorian Vale, and 3 days ago he had been crowned Alpha King of the Ironclaw Pack. Now his hand was pointing across the hall at a woman's throat, at the faint blue marks running along her neck. Who had dared touch what was his? What she said next would silence the whole pack. Stay with me on this one. Now let me back up, because you need to understand who these people were before that table cracked in half. Dorian Vale was not a man you argued with. He stood a full head taller than anyone in the pack, and when he walked through the Highland village, people stepped aside without being told. He had earned the crown the hard way. The old Alpha, a cruel and bloated wolf named Corin, had run the Ironclaw Pack into the ground for 20 years. He taxed the hunters until they starved. He took what he wanted and no one ever got it back. And when Dorian finally challenged him under the winter moon, the fight lasted less than a minute. Corin went down. Dorian stood over him and did not finish it. He let the old wolf crawl away into exile. That single act of mercy was the reason half the pack loved him and the other half feared him. A wolf strong enough to kill and choosing not to. That kind of man keeps people guessing, and people who guess about their king don't sleep easy. But the crown had changed something in him. 3 days as king, and already the whispers had started. That he was too soft. That mercy was weakness. That a real alpha would have torn Corin's throat out and hung his hide on the wall. Dorian heard every whisper. He heard them the way you hear a dripping faucet in the dark. The kind of sound that gets louder the harder you try to ignore it. And a man who feels the ground shifting under him gets dangerous. He starts looking for a way to prove he is still the strongest thing in the room. He starts waiting for someone to give him a reason. Then there was Freya Lindqvist. She was not born to the Ironclaw Pack. She wasn't born to any pack at all, and that mattered more than anyone said out loud. Dorian had found her half dead in the eastern woods 2 moons back, tangled in a hunter's snare, her leg torn open to the bone. Human hunters, the kind who set steel traps and never checked them. Any other alpha would have walked past. A lone wolf, no pack, no name, no use to anyone. But Dorian knelt in the snow and worked the trap open with his bare hands, and he carried her the 11 miles back to the highlands himself, never once setting her down. He called her his mate before she could even stand on her own, and the pack did not like it, understand what that meant. An Alpha King is supposed to bond with someone of standing, a daughter of another pack, an alliance, sealed in blood and bone, worth something to everyone. Instead, Dorian had chosen a stranger with no lineage anyone could trace, a woman who spoke little and trusted less, who kept a rusted old blade under her pillow and slept with one eye open. To the older wolves, she was a wound in the pack's pride. And more than one of them had started to wonder aloud whether she was exactly what she seemed, or whether she was something worse that had walked in wearing a limp. Freya knew all of it. She wasn't stupid. She felt the eyes on her back in the great hall. She heard the talk stop when she entered a room and start again the moment she left, and she never once tried to soften it. She held her chin up and looked those wolves dead in the eye, and that made them hate her more, because a woman with nothing to her name should have been grateful, and Freya Lindqvist was not grateful to anyone. She had learned somewhere that gratitude was just another kind of collar. The only creature in the whole Highlands she trusted was Bram. Bram was old. A battle-scarred wolfhound, gray around the muzzle, one ear torn to a ragged stump, a limp in his left hip from a wound so old nobody remembered how he got it. He wasn't a wolf. He was a dog, an ordinary hound, and by every rule of the pack he had no business inside those walls at all. But Bram had come out of the eastern woods trailing Freya the night Dorian carried her home, following the blood scent for 11 miles on that bad hip, and he had not left her side since. He slept across her door. He ate from her hand. And when anyone raised their voice near her, that old dog put himself between her and the sound, low and quiet, teeth showing just enough to be understood. The pack laughed at him, a half-crippled mutt guarding an alpha's mate. But nobody, and I mean nobody, tried him twice. There was something in Bram's eyes that had seen worse than any of them, and it looked back without blinking. A young wolf named Havard had kicked at him once early on, just to show he could. Bram didn't so much as flinch. He just turned and looked at Havard until Havard was the one who walked away. Believe me, that story got around. So that was the shape of things. A new king with the ground moving under him, a mate the pack wanted gone, and an old dog who would die before he let anyone touch her. It was a room full of dry timber and everybody was carrying a torch. All it needed was a spark. The spark came on the third night after the crowning. There was a feast in the great hall, the kind that was supposed to seal Dorian's rule. Every wolf of standing was there, packed onto the long benches, the fires roaring, meat on every board. Dorian sat at the high table with Freya at his right hand, and you could feel the resentment coming off the older wolves like heat off a stone. They watched him honor her. They watched her sit in the seat that should have gone to one of their daughters, and they waited the way wolves do, patient and hungry, for the meat to slip. Near the middle of the feast, Freya reached across the table for the water jug and her collar shifted. Just an inch, just enough. And in the firelight, Dorian saw them. Marks. Faint blue and yellow bruises, 4 of them spaced along the side of her neck. The exact spacing of a hand. I want you to understand what a mind like Dorian's did with that. 3 days of whispers that he was weak. 3 days of feeling the crown slip through his fingers. A pack full of wolves who thought his mate was a fraud. And now, on her throat, the marks of another man's grip. His blood went cold and then it went to fire, and every fear he'd been swallowing for 3 days came up his throat at once. He didn't ask her. That was the mistake. A wiser man would have leaned in close and asked her quietly, mouth to her ear, where nobody could hear the answer. But Dorian Vale was not in that moment a wise man. He was a frightened king who had just been handed the one thing he could not survive. Proof, to his own eyes, that someone had touched what was his and lived to bruise her. He stood up so fast the bench went over behind him. That was the crash. That was the table splitting, the goblet ringing, the whole hall going dead silent. That was the fist coming down and the roar shaking the torches. And now you know why. WHO, Dorian's voice filled every corner of that hall. Which of you laid hands on her? Show me your face. Show me now and I'll make it quick. Hide from me and I'll make it last 3 days. Nobody spoke. 50 wolves and not one of them breathed. His eyes swept the benches. He was looking for a flinch, a dropped gaze, any sign of guilt. And here is the terrible thing. Half those wolves hated Freya enough to want her ruined, and every one of them knew that a single wrong word right now could end with a body on the floor. So they sat frozen, and their silence looked exactly like the silence of the guilty, and Dorian read it that way. He read the whole room as an enemy hiding one man in its ranks. "You think I won't tear this hall apart to find him," he said, lower now, which was worse. "You think the crown made me soft. Corin thought that too. Ask him how it went." He turned to Freya, and for the first time his voice cracked. "Tell me his name," he said. "Whoever he was, whatever he threatened you with. I will bring you his head before sunrise and you will never have to fear him again. Just give me the name." He thought he was being tender. He thought he was offering to protect her. That was the sickest part of it. In his own mind, Dorian was being a good mate, promising to avenge her. He could not see that he was standing over her with his fists shaking, accusing her in front of the whole pack of belonging to another man. Freya looked up at him. She did not cower. She did not cry. She set down the water jug she was still holding, very slowly, the way you set down something you might otherwise throw, and she looked at her mate like she was seeing him clearly for the first time and did not much like what she saw. "There's no name," she said. "Don't protect him." "I'm not protecting anyone." Her voice was flat and hard as a blade left out in the cold. "There is no man, Dorian. There never was." "Then who put those marks on your neck?" And that was the moment the old dog moved. Bram had been lying in the rushes by the wall, gray head on his paws, watching. He'd been watching the whole feast, the way he watched everything, and he'd seen the bench go over. When Dorian's voice rose the second time, the hound got to his feet. Slow on that bad hip, no hurry in him at all. He walked the length of the high table, right across the front of 50 staring wolves, and he stopped between Freya and the king. Then he turned to face Dorian, and he lowered his head, and from deep in that scarred old chest came a growl you could feel in your teeth. The whole hall stared. A dog, an ordinary hound, half lame, gray in the muzzle, planting himself in front of an alpha king who could have broken his spine with one hand. Dorian looked down at him. "Move, old man," he said. Bram did not move. The growl got lower, and something flickered across Dorian's face then. Confusion, mostly, because in all his rage, some small, clear part of his mind had just noticed something it could not explain. This dog had never once growled at him. Not the night in the woods, not the 11 miles home, not in 2 moons of sleeping across Freya's door. Bram had watched Dorian carry his mistress through the snow and had trusted him with her, and a dog like that does not give trust and take it back for nothing. So why now? Why, of everyone in this hall full of wolves who hated her, was the old dog putting himself between Freya and Dorian? That question hung in the air, and for one breath the fire went out of the king's face. He looked from the dog to the woman and back, and you could see him trying to make it fit and failing. Then someone laughed. It was a young wolf near the back, one of Corin's old followers, that lean, cruel one named Havard. He laughed, sharp and ugly, and it broke the spell. "Look at that," Havard called out. The great Alpha King, held off by a lame dog and a stray with no pack. This is what mercy buys you, Dorian. A mate who lets other men mark her and a mutt to guard her secrets. The hall went cold again, because that was the real challenge and everyone heard it. Havard wasn't talking about Freya anymore. He was talking about the crown. Now here's the thing. Up to that second this had been one kind of story. A jealous man, an accusation, a bruise on a neck. Ugly but small. Something that could have ended with an apology and a hard night's sleep. But the moment Havard spoke, it became something else entirely. Because now it wasn't about Freya's neck. It was about whether Dorian Vale was fit to be king at all. Havard had said the quiet thing out loud, in front of every wolf of standing in the Highlands, and if Dorian let it stand, he was finished. If he backed down now, if he apologized, if he showed 1 ounce of doubt, the pack would smell weakness and the challenges would come like wolves to a wounded deer. Corin's people had been waiting 3 days for exactly this. A public crack, a reason to move, and they had it. The king's own mate, marked by another man, defended by a dog, and the king himself frozen over the both of them, unable to act. Dorian felt the floor shift under him. He felt the whole thing tipping, 3 days of crown sliding toward the edge. And a cornered king does the most dangerous thing there is. He decides he has to win this in front of everyone, right now, no matter the cost. He reached down and grabbed Bram by the scruff. The old dog snarled and twisted, but he was slow and lame and Dorian was mountain strong, and in one motion the king lifted him and threw him aside. Bram hit the stone and yelped. A sharp, broken sound, and rolled against the base of the wall and lay there, sides heaving, trying to get his bad hip back under him. Freya made a sound like she'd been struck. And Dorian turned back to her, and now there was no tenderness left in him at all, only the terror of a man watching his crown slide off his head. "You will tell me," he said, "in front of all of them who touched you, or I will name you a liar to this whole pack and turn you out into the woods tonight. No mate of mine keeps secrets that make a fool of me." There it was. The thing had turned all the way over. It was no longer jealousy. It was survival, hers and his both. She had to speak now or lose everything. He had to break her now or lose everything. And 50 wolves leaned in to watch one of them go down. If you've ever been in a room where you could feel a thing about to break, you know how quiet it got. If you're still with me, this is the part where it all comes apart, so hit that subscribe button and stay right here because you do not want to miss what she did next. Freya did not answer him right away. She got up from the high table. She stepped down off the dais past the king and she went to the old dog against the wall. She knelt in the rushes and put her hands on him, checking his hip, his ribs, murmuring something too low to hear. Bram licked her wrist once. He was all right. Bruised, shaken, but all right. And when she was sure of it, only then, Freya stood back up and faced the whole hall. "You want to know who put these marks on my neck," she said. Her voice carried now clear to the back benches. "Fine, I'll tell you. But not one of you is going to like it, least of all you, Dorian." She reached up and undid the clasp of her collar. She pulled it down all the way past her collarbone and she turned her neck to the firelight so every wolf in that hall could see. And it was not 4 marks, it was dozens. The bruises Dorian had seen were only the top of it. Below them, running down under the collar, along her shoulder, across the top of her chest, was a map of old wounds. Scars, half-healed cuts, the yellow of bruises fading and fresh bruises coming up beneath them. And around her throat, plain as anything once you saw it, was a band of raw and blistered skin. The unmistakable mark of a collar, an iron collar, the kind you put on a slave. The hall made a sound. 50 wolves all at once, a low, ugly gasp. "These aren't the marks of a lover," Freya said. "You want to know where I got them? I got them in a fighting pit 200 miles east of here. A human pit, where men bet silver on wolves in chains and starve them until they'll tear each other apart for a scrap of meat. That's where I was born, Dorian. That's the lineage none of you can trace. I don't have a pack because my pack was a cage, and the marks on my neck are from the iron they kept me in for 19 years. Nobody moved. Nobody laughed now. The wolves who'd wanted her gone an hour ago couldn't meet her eyes. "The snare in the eastern woods," she went on, "the one you pulled me out of. I wasn't a stray who wandered too far. I was running. I'd killed the man who owned me and I ran 3 days without stopping and I got careless and I stepped in a hunter's trap and I was lying there bleeding out, ready to die free rather than go back in the pit. And then a wolf I'd never met knelt down in the snow and opened it with his bare hands." She looked at Dorian. "So no man marked me that you need to avenge. The only man who ever touched my neck in kindness is the one standing in front of me, and you just threw the only other creature who ever protected me across a stone floor." Dorian's mouth opened. Nothing came out, but she was not finished. Because there was more, and this was the part that stopped the king's heart in his chest. "You asked me once," Freya said, quieter now, but the hall was so silent it didn't matter, "how a half-dead stray managed to survive the night I was carrying you home. You don't remember, do you? The fever took your memory of it. Let me give it back." Dorian went very still. 11 miles, Freya said. "You carried me, yes, for the first 6. And then the wound in your side, the one you got from Corin's ambush that same night, the one you never told anyone about because a king can't show a wound in his first week. That wound opened up in the cold, and you dropped in the snow with me still in your arms, 4 miles from home, and you did not get up." The wolves turned to look at their king. Dorian did not deny it. His face had gone gray. "I couldn't walk," Freya said. "My leg was in ribbons, so I dragged you. I dragged you and myself both, on one good leg, through the snow in the dark for 4 miles, with Bram pulling at your collar the whole way to keep me moving when I wanted to lie down and quit. I bit through your wound and I packed it with snow and moss, and I would not let you freeze. I kept an alpha king alive because he was the first living thing in 19 years that ever showed me a kindness, and I would have died before I let the cold take him." She let that sit. "That's the night I saved your life, Dorian, and you crowned me your mate and never once knew it because you were unconscious for it, and I never told you because I didn't want to be your mate out of debt. I wanted you to want me for what you saw. Well, now you've seen everything, so here I am. Turn me out into the woods if you like. I've survived worse than woods." The silence in that hall was the loudest thing I've ever tried to describe, and into it, from over by the wall, came a soft sound. Bram had gotten to his feet again. He limped across the rushes, past the king, and he sat down beside Freya, leaned his gray head against her leg, and stared up at Dorian with those old scarred eyes. And Dorian understood, finally, why the dog had growled. Bram hadn't been protecting Freya's secret from the king. He'd been protecting Freya from the one man in the world she had believed would never raise a hand near her. The dog had watched her save that man's life in the snow. And the dog had just watched that same man threaten to throw her into the dark for a wound she'd earned in chains. Dorian Vale, Alpha King of the Ironclaw Pack, dropped to his knees in front of the whole hall. It was not a small thing for a king to do. Kneeling in his own hall, 3 days crowned, with Corrin's people watching for weakness. It was the most dangerous thing he could possibly do, and he did it anyway. He knelt down on the cold stone until his head was level with hers, and he reached out, slow, and he touched the raw band of skin around her throat with 2 fingers, so gently it would not have crushed a moth. "I dragged you back," she said softly, "and you never knew. So let me be clear about one thing, husband. I did not save your life so you could take mine." "I know," Dorian said. His voice had nothing left in it. "I know that now." He turned his head, still on his knees, and looked at Havard at the back of the hall. "You wanted to know what mercy buys me," Dorian said. "Here's your answer. Mercy is the reason this woman is still alive to shame me in my own hall. I let a lot of things go the night I took this crown. I let Corrin crawl away. I'll let your words tonight go too, once." He rose to his feet, and the king was backing him now, all of it. "But you laid the shape of a lie in front of my pack and let me swing at it. So you'll leave this hall, and you'll leave these highlands, and you'll take whoever thinks the way you do with you. The Ironclaw Pack has room for wolves who question their king. It has no room for wolves who'd use his fear to break him." Havard's face went white. He looked around for support and found none. Because the whole hall had just watched a woman with an iron scar around her throat stand taller than any of them, and there was not a wolf on those benches who wanted to be counted next to the one who'd sneered at her. Havard got up and walked out into the dark, and a handful of the old guard went after him, and the great door boomed shut behind them, and that was the end of the plot against Dorian Vale. It died right there, killed by the truth of a slave's scars. Dorian turned back to Freya. But she was already looking down at Bram. "He needs looking at," she said, "his hip." "I'll carry him," Dorian said, and he did. The Alpha King of the Highlands bent down and gathered up a lame old wolfhound as gently as he'd once gathered up a dying stray, and he carried him out of the great hall with Freya at his side, and every wolf they passed lowered their eyes. Not in fear this time, in something closer to shame, and something closer to respect. Now I could end it there, and it would be a good place to stop. but you deserve to know how it settled, because the way a thing settles tells you what it really was. Bram's hip healed. It took most of a moon, and Freya slept beside him the whole time, and Dorian brought the dog meat from his own plate every night without being asked. The old hound never did growl at the king again. He went back to sleeping across Freya's door. But now some nights he slept across Dorian's too, and the king took that for the forgiveness it was, because a dog like Bram does not forgive easy, and he does not forgive twice. The marks on Freya's neck faded, not all of them. The iron band around her throat left a scar that never fully went, a pale ring she carried the rest of her life. And here is the thing that surprised the whole pack. She never hid it again. She wore her collars low from that night on, that ring plain for anyone to see. Because she had learned something in the Great Hall, the scar wasn't her shame, it was her proof. 19 years in a cage, and she'd walked out of it and dragged a king through the snow, and there wasn't a wolf born to any lineage in those highlands who had done anything half as strong. The pack came to understand it too in time. The story got told and retold at the fires, the way stories do, and each time it got a little truer instead of a little wilder, which almost never happens. The stray with no pack became the mate who saved the alpha's life. The lame dog became the hound who stood between a king and his worst mistake. And Dorian Vale, the man they'd whispered was too soft to rule, became the king who knelt in his own hall and was made stronger for it, not weaker. Because it turns out the pack didn't want a wolf who never bent. They wanted a wolf strong enough to bend and still be standing after. As for Dorian and Freya, I won't dress it up. It wasn't perfect after that. He carried the shame of that night a long while, the memory of throwing the old dog, the memory of what he'd nearly done. Some nights she'd catch him looking at the scar on her throat with his jaw tight, and she'd take his hand and put it flat against the ring of it and hold it there until he stopped flinching. That was how they mended it, not with words. With his hand on the very mark he'd once accused her over, until it stopped being an accusation and started being a promise. Years later, when Dorian was old and gray himself and the highlands were the most peaceful they'd been in 100 winters, a young wolf asked him what the hardest fight of his reign had been. Everyone expected him to say Corin. The winter challenge. The bloody first year. Dorian shook his head. The hardest fight, he said, was a night in the Great Hall 3 days after they crowned me, when I stood over the strongest person I ever knew and mistook her scars for someone else's crime. I nearly lost the whole thing that night. Not the crown, her. And an old dog with a bad hip and better sense than me put himself in the way and gave me just enough time to come to my senses. He was quiet a moment. You want to be a good alpha. When your blood's up and you're sure you know what those marks mean, stop. Ask. The truth is almost never the ugly thing you're afraid of. Sometimes it's the strongest thing that ever walked into your hall, and it's standing right in front of you, waiting to see if you'll be man enough to hear it. And that young wolf never forgot it. Neither did the pack. They put it on the stone above the Great Hall door, 4 words that outlasted every wolf who'd been in the room that night. Not the king's name, not the pack's. Just what Freya had made them all understand. Ask before you strike. That's the whole of it. A cracked table, an old dog, and a woman who dragged a king through the snow and never once asked to be thanked for it. The marks on her neck weren't a betrayal. They were the reason he was alive to accuse her at all. And the pack remembered that a lot longer than they'd have remembered any blood spilled before dawn.